My name is Daniel Nettle. I study human behaviour from an evolutionary perspective at Newcastle University in the UK. So one question that we always ask ourselves is, what's so special about the human mind? In what ways is it unique? In what ways might it be similar to those that we find in related animals? So before we can say anything about the human mind, let's say something about the human brain. The first thing to notice about it is it's very big. It's much bigger than the brain of a chimpanzee, about 3 times as big, in fact, whereas the body of a human is only marginally bigger than that of a chimpanzee. So something we see in the 5 or 6 million years since our ancestors diverged from those of the chimpanzee is that the brain has increased enormously in size. And I think we're still struggling to understand what that means. It's a very interesting phenomenon because the brain is very expensive. You need a lot of energy, particularly when you're growing up, to make and run this expensive organ. And presumably this wouldn't have occurred if there weren't very strong fitness payoffs to having this large brain. The large brain really begins a couple of million years ago, seriously, and by 500,000 years ago it's at its fully modern size. So something's clearly happening during that long period which is causing brains to expand very, very rapidly. People have speculated about what might be going on. One thing that's very clear is that humans are very adept at social cognition and social reasoning, so we effortlessly remember the names, rough life stories, relationships of dozens of people. And we can instantly compute what would happen if Simon said to Fred that Bob didn't want Jill to go to wherever. We can effortlessly kind of grasp the dynamics of these situations. So our social cognition it uses up an enormous part of our intellectual energy. And that's actually true for people living in very different situations all over the world. It's true also of our related primate species, but human social networks are much bigger. And the sort of patterns of alliances and friendships and so on seem to be even more complex. So one suggestion is that as our social world became more complicated, big brains were needed to make that possible. Of course, we have to ask what's fueling, what's providing the energy that makes those big brains a possible evolutionary response. And there we have some very interesting suggestions. So human children are juvenile for much longer than chimpanzees. They grow slowly, during which time they're growing and then using this large brain, during which time they require a lot of provisioning. So something that's happening is that parents are making a much greater total input into each of their offspring than would be true in another ape. And the interesting thing about humans is it's not just mum that's doing that. There's lots of evidence from lots of different societies now that children actually require a whole network of adults to provision them. Mothers always, very often grandmothers, particularly maternal grandmothers, also mum's friends, often dad, and other kind of figures from the surrounding community. So really we've shifted to a system from basically individual breeding to this kind of assisted breeding where the mother is a key figure but she's surrounded by a network of others who are providing energy into offspring. Such that in fact, in many different types of societies, young humans don't really start to pay their way in terms of the resources they bring in until they're in their 20s or even later. Whereas a young chimpanzee, by the age of 2 or 3, is providing already all of the calories that it needs. So in humans we have this long period when the young are subsidized by the older. And the sort of flip side of that is that fully mature humans can produce a vast surplus. That's very obvious in modern affluent societies, but even amongst hunter-gatherers, a 30, 40-year-old adult can actually produce enough calories in a day, not just for themselves, but to subsidize that younger generation. So something has shifted around the provisioning of the young who are then growing and using these very, very large brains. Related to that, to this greater kind of socialization of reproduction, I think is a greater socialization of everything, in fact, in humans. So chimpanzees are very smart, but what we see amongst humans is that we solve problems collectively. If I want to know how to make a film, I don't have to start from scratch because there's other people who make films already, and I can ask them, how do you do it? Or they can demonstrate to me how they can do it. And it's not just the people who are present today. There's also a kind of chain of learning which goes back in time. So I can learn from the people who made films 10 years ago, but they in turn learn from the people who made films 10 years before that, and they in turn learn from the people who made films 10 years before that, right back to the dawn of this technology. So what you have, in other words, is culture. the transmission of learnt information down generations of people, cultural generations of people. And the interesting thing about that is it becomes more complicated over time. Filmmaking is a more sophisticated art now than it was 100 years ago, and that's exactly because each generation doesn't just copy the previous one, but rather scaffolds its learning off all the learning that the previous generation did, and then adds its own bit. And that's why all over the world, in many domains of human activity, you actually see things that become more sophisticated over time. And although various other animals have technology, and they have things like birdsong which are transmitted from generation to generation, in the human case, uniquely, you have this cumulative increase in sophistication of technology, which surely must be related to the fact that there are humans all over the globe, in every different ecosystem, extracting an enormous amount of the productivity of the world through these very sophisticated technologies, which no individual person could have come up with on their own. And that's explaining that, the origins of this social learning and complex cumulative culture, is one of the big challenges for people who want to understand modern human behaviour.